Have you ever wanted to know more about the hidden history of jiu-jitsu in America, including details even most experts don't know? If so, you should sign up for BJJ Mental Models Premium. Hi, I'm Jeff Shaw. I'm a professor at Western Washington University where I teach a history of martial arts class, and I'm also the head instructor at Bellingham BJJ. BJJ Mental Models Premium will give you access to my course, This Is Why We Fight, History of Jiu-Jitsu in America, which is 12 classes, including a bunch of research that you can't get anywhere else. You can get it for free for the first week and start learning right away, plus you'll get access to a bunch of other amazing courses by people like Emily Kwok, Dominika Olenite, Stefan Kesting, and other experts that I learn a ton from. So if you are interested, BJJ Mental Models Premium is your way to go.
Hey everybody, welcome to BJJ Mental Models episode 405. I'm Steve Kwan, and BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And this is an exciting episode. We have a jiu-jitsu themed book report to talk about. I have Itamar Shatz on the line. Itamar, sir, how are you doing?
Great. Thank you. Great to be here.
I am happy to have you. Now, when you reached out to me and we started talking and I learned about what you've been working on, this was of tremendous interest to me. First of all, because it's quite relevant to people who train jiu-jitsu, but also because of your pedigree in jiu-jitsu as well. It's not often that you see this combination of different practices that come together and they put together a resource that can help people in our community that also I think is broadly applicable to the rest of the world as well. Probably better coming from you though. Why don't you tell everyone about who you are and the work that we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm a Jiu-Jitsu black belt at BTT Cambridge under Leo Gamarra. I'm also a researcher at Cambridge University, where I teach quantitative and computational social science. And the book I'm talking about today is Solving Procrastination, which is a guide to figuring out why we procrastinate and how to finally stop. I'm publishing it with Penguin Random House, and it's been covered in places like the New York Times, BBC News, Inc. Magazine, and a whole lot of others.
Now that is cool. To get that kind of coverage and to get a publisher like that behind you is awesome. And especially because you're a jiu-jitsu black belt, I think that you're going to have some great takes here that are relevant to the audience. Procrastination is a problem that touches us in many ways in grappling. I mean, on one hand, at the very simplest, it can just be procrastinating to get to the gym, to do the training that we know we should be doing. But beyond that, procrastination can be a social thing. There might be things that you know you should be doing, like having difficult conversations with your coach, and it's easy to put things off. It's hard to advocate for yourself sometimes when there's something that you need in jiu-jitsu, and oftentimes procrastination can be a part of that. Maybe we should start from the basis of your work, though. What have you been doing that led to the creation of this book, and what were your findings?
So I used to be a huge procrastinator in school. When I was in high school, I was the typical, you have a semester-long project that you don't work on for the entire semester. And then the night before it's due, I would stay up all night and then finish it in a rush. Do an okay job, get away with it, but obviously it was not very good for me. And then when I got to, as I grew up and I got to a university and I became a master's student, one of the things I wanted to do is figure out how I can live life better and how I can do things better. And I turned to science for that. So it started looking through a lot of research papers and figure out, okay, here's how I can be more effective doing this, or here's how I can communicate better, make better decisions, be more productive, and things like this. And naturally, at one point, I said, okay, let's work on procrastination. Let's figure out how to avoid procrastinating. And I've started writing an article about that. I've started looking into it, and I was writing articles and sharing these with other people at the time. And I started writing an article about procrastination. And then I realized that one article is not enough. It was too big of a problem. Too many people were suffering from it. There was so much that we knew in research on how to deal with it that I just could not fit everything into a single paper, into a single article that I shared. So I said, okay, I'll write 2 articles. And then that snowballed to 4 articles. And then I said, you know what? I just need to create a whole website for this. And I did that. And I expanded it and I kept diving into it. And at a certain point I said, okay, a website is also not the perfect format for this because it's hard to really dive into something. And that is when I decided to write the book. Because you can get people to read, I don't know, a 10,000 word article on a website, but you can't get them to read something much longer when it's in a book. And that's when I could really dive into what procrastination is, why we do it, how we can overcome it in practice, just connecting threads from hundreds of different studies into a practical guide that people can actually use.
Well, let me start this off by asking you, just from the very beginning, what is procrastination? I think from a vibe standpoint, everyone understands, but is there an actual scientific definition for what you found? How do you explain to someone what this actually is?
Yeah, so procrastination is when we put off something, even though we know we shouldn't, and even though we usually don't intend to do it. So when we tell ourselves, I'll bring up this issue to my coach, and then we go to the gym and we don't mention it, even though we want to, and then we get back home and we say, damn, I should have said something. And then we repeat that again and again. Or when we tell ourselves, I've been meaning to come back to training, I've taken this break, I'll go tomorrow. And then once tomorrow arrives, something is wrong, and I say, I'll go tomorrow, and again, and this cycle repeats itself. And the thing that makes it procrastination isn't that we're just putting it off, but rather that we know we shouldn't be putting it off, and we do it anyway.
Interesting. So from a psychological and scientific basis, is there actually a reason why this happens? Like, is there a medical or a scientific explanation for why people procrastinate? I ask because in jiu-jitsu, as you know, oftentimes when we talk about things like this, people say it's just, a mental toughness issue. You just got to do it. And I guess that's true to some extent, but it doesn't get into how sometimes when people act a certain way, there may even be a biological reason for that. I'm wondering if that applies in the case of procrastination as well.
Absolutely. And I have to say that the whole just do it, the problem is that it's kind of presenting the solution. The problem is that if it was the solution, yes, we should just do it. And we even know that we should just do it, but we can't bring ourselves to do that, which is why the approach of I should just do it doesn't usually actually translate to practice, doesn't actually help us, even if it feels and sounds right at the moment. And the reason we procrastinate, the reason we put things off, even though we know we shouldn't, is basically our brains are hardwired to pursue immediate pleasure and avoid immediate pain. And this comes from evolutionary roots where basically it was really important to focus on the immediate. So run away from that lion right now or get eaten, or find shelter right now or freeze to death, or get food right now or starve. And this was great very long ago, but in the modern life where we often have to work with much more nebulous outcomes that are less visceral and that have much longer time horizons, the problem is that focusing on only the immediate doesn't work as well. So the analogy I like to use for this is sugar. Basically, our brains evolved to crave sugar, and that really made sense initially when sugar was really hard to come by. But now in the modern world, when sugar is basically everywhere in very, very, very unhealthy amounts, this isn't adaptive anymore. So this initial desire for sugar is now terrible for us because it's so available. The same thing applies to procrastination. This initial desire for focusing on the immediate doesn't work today in a world that is much more complex and that requires much longer term planning.
I get it. Yeah, it's funny you bring this up. This is how I often explain things to my kid because she's always asking, as children do, why, Dad? Why does this happen? And I explained to her that there are many things about human beings that are hardwired into us biologically that made sense hundreds of thousands of years ago, but don't serve us as well in a modern society. Sometimes our brains still go into resource scarcity mode or fight or flight mode when it really doesn't make sense for us to do so because, the stakes are not that high for many of us for the work that we're doing. Jiu-jitsu is a great example of that. It's easy to trigger biological impulses when we feel like we're fighting with people, and it's only after someone's been training for a long time that they realize, this isn't really a fight at all. It's a sport. It's an art. We don't need to be in constant fight or flight when we go to the gym. And part of the reason we train is because that inoculates us against that kind of impulse that makes jiu-jitsu so scary the first time someone comes to the mats. Procrastination is an issue that I hear coming up a lot for jiu-jitsu people in a variety of different forms. One that you brought up is just maintaining the habit, getting to the gym as frequently as you would like. And people tend to lack empathy when it comes to how they deal with this problem. First of all, the advice from coaches normally is to just tell people you need to have more discipline, you need to work harder, you need to be more driven. That's not very empathetic of the situation that the person is in if they're procrastinating, because it might not always be that they're just sitting there doing nothing. There's probably a lot of amply good reasons why they're procrastinating, like other life priorities. I mean, people are incredibly busy. We have a lot of things on our plate. And if someone is not training as hard as they want to, they probably have lots of excuses that are completely valid for why that is. And that lack of empathy is a kind of a connecting thread that I see when we talk about things like procrastination in jiu-jitsu, not just from the coach, but a lack of empathy that people show themselves, where they beat themselves up for like, oh man, I just couldn't come to the gym today and there must be something wrong with me. But often it's in the broader context, there's a lot of other things going on in people's lives. What are your feelings around this, and how can we be better about communicating to get people to procrastinate less?
Yeah, I think these are great points. I can take my own example. This year was probably one of the worst ones for my BJJ journey in the sense that I think I've learned very little, and it's tough. So especially when I was lower belt, I was coming in constantly doing double sessions, being super deliberate about drilling. And this year, basically life got in the way. And I was beating myself up over it because I felt even when I was showing up to class, I wasn't being deliberate. I was kind of showing up, doing sparring, but not really feeling like I was learning. And at a certain point, I said, you know what? That's okay. Here in the long run, there are going to be times when life gets in the way, whether it's because of parenting, whether it's because of work. And I would actually push back on the idea that this is procrastination. I think procrastination makes more sense to treat it as procrastination when there is not a good reason for why we're doing what we're doing. But in cases where life genuinely does get in the way, it's perfectly fine to say this is maybe purposeful delay. This is something that makes sense, and this is something that is better for us in the long term. So we shouldn't treat it as something bad, and we should be more understanding. And I would say when it comes to empathy, I think not only is empathy the right thing to do, it's also more constructive here. Because if somebody really wants to make a change, but for whatever reason they can't, telling them you're not disciplined enough usually is not going to actually help them in any way. It's going to make them feel worse, primarily. It's going to get them to disengage. And very rarely is it actually going to be the thing that they need to hear at the moment in order to be able to take action.
That type of second order thinking and trying to understand the consequences of your actions and what will actually become of them in the long term. Again, this is something I've been trying to get into my kids' head, and I've been trying to explain that you need to look beyond what you're doing just in the moment right now and think about the long-term implications of whether it will actually serve your goals. Will throwing a tantrum right now actually get you the response that you want? It might feel good in the moment to do so, but it's unlikely to motivate people to give you what you want going forward. And I think the way that we talk about procrastination is another great example. If you use procrastination as a way to embarrass and humiliate people that you don't feel are training hard enough, that's really not going to motivate them to want to come and spend more time with you in the gym.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I talk about in the book is the self-control fallacy. And that's the idea that if we just try harder, we'll be able to get ourselves to do what we need to. And, if we had perfect self-control, if we had perfect willpower, the answer is yes, we would be able to get ourselves to do whatever we needed to, within the realm of physical reality. But we are human, we're imperfect, and none of us has perfect willpower or perfect self-control. Now, focusing on self-control as a solution is really convenient because then you're kind of not actually trying to look for a real solution. You're not doing the deep thinking that will be productive and that will lead to a solution. You're just saying, okay, you need to do X, and if you can't do that, then it's your problem. But if in reality, we know that it doesn't actually work, and we see again and again that even though we think self-control will solve it, it doesn't work, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work, then we should adjust accordingly and realize we need to look for a deeper solution that will actually change our behavior in reality, even if it's less, maybe like less of a silver bullet.
Yeah, the example that has been on my mind recently is things like GLP-1s, weight loss drugs like Ozempic. There are a lot of personal trainers who are very upset about these things. They look at these as being the quote unquote wrong way to lose weight. And I don't quite understand why they would get so upset about that, except for maybe some sort of feeling of ownership over the domain of health. I mean, if the goal is that, hey, we know that if people lose excess weight, they're going to live longer and be happier, don't we want them to do that? I mean, yeah, maybe it's better if people could just do that without any assistance. Maybe that would be preferable. But at the end of the day, we should be focused on the results that we want to see. And if people are finding a way to improve their quality of life and you're effectively trying to shut that down, you're just creating a situation where they're not going to want to work with you in the future. I think that we need to think more long-term about how we can steer the kind of behavior that we want. And procrastination is a big part of that, because with jiu-jitsu, getting people to train, to meet their goals, these are scary things for people. Training jiu-jitsu is much harder than riding a bicycle. There are way more considerations, particularly social ones, that make it a scary activity. And if we want to grow the sport, we need to find a way to bring people in rather than have them feel like we're doing some sort of moral purity test about whether they're good enough or disciplined enough to train here with us.
Exactly. And I think it's very easy to forget that when you're, for better or worse, in a position of power. So when you're a coach and, whether you should have a position of authority over others is a different question, but in practice, people will look up to you. And it's easy to forget what it was like when you were just a beginner, what it was like when you were just a white belt, when you were just starting out, when you were looking for approval from higher belts, when you didn't have that experience, when you had that initial fight or flight where basically you're stepping into the gym and your body goes into that, oh my God, I'm in danger. Or when you wanted to bring something up and your body basically seizes up and says, this is bad, I should be running away from this. And again, it's not a question of whether this should be the case or shouldn't be the case, but rather this is the case in reality. So it's important for us to adjust for that and act accordingly.
Gotcha. Now, one of the things you told me about your book, which makes it stand out, is trying to put together a practical handbook, real suggestions that work in the real world to help people combat procrastination. And I think people who are listening to this probably have a feeling as to whether they're procrastinating or not and are likely looking for a solution. You get into this a lot, and maybe we can cover that. What are some of these strategies and tactics that you suggest people use if they identify, I'm procrastinating more than I would like to? How can I now actually do something about it and make lasting change in my life?
So it's a great question. One of the things I talk about is that procrastination is a very varied problem. And then somebody who procrastinates because of burnout is very different from someone who procrastinates because of distractions, or someone who procrastinates because of maybe they're not confident enough or because they're afraid of something. And because of that, one of the major things that I talk about in the book is the first step is basically reflecting on your procrastination to figure out why you in particular procrastinate. Because ultimately, you need to find out that particular reason in order to be able to find the relevant solution for addressing it. And then once we do that, once we ask ourselves, okay, why am I procrastinating here? And the important thing is to not just look at the reason that is necessarily on the surface, but also keep asking why. A bit like your kids maybe, and then trying to figure out what is the actual reason that is driving the behavior. And once we do that, we can start finding solutions. So let's focus on fear, because we've talked about that a lot, and I think it's a very common reason in the context of jiu-jitsu. So let's say you realize, I want to bring this thing up to my coach, but actually the reason I don't do it is because I'm worried. And one thing that could be useful here is to decatastrophize the situation. And basically the issue is often when we have an initial concern, our brain kind of tricks us into thinking, okay, not only is this concern way more likely than it actually is, but it's also going to be much more terrible than it actually is. So maybe we want to bring something up to our coach, and our initial instinct is, if I bring it up, then he's going to hate me and he's going to kick me out of the gym, or he's going to mock me, or whatever it is. And if you're in a place where your coach is actually likely to do this, then that's a whole different problem. And I would recommend you find a better gym. But I would say for most people, this concern is probably blown out of proportion. And what can then be useful to do is try to say, okay, is this actually likely to happen? Let's look back at the interactions I've had with my coach. Has he actually ever treated me that way? Has he ever treated anyone else that way? What if he is upset? Is there any follow-up I can do to deal with the situation? And what we're doing here is sort of shining a light on the fear to figure out what specifically we're afraid of, how we can make that feel less intimidating, and how we can move on if we actually do handle the situation we were worried about.
Yeah, I find that to be a very relatable problem in jiu-jitsu. Man, if social media is any indication, you hear people, go on and post these giant stories about, oh man, this thing's happening in the gym and it's been driving me crazy. What should I do about it? And the answer is usually, well, did you talk to them? And
exactly.
Most of the time people don't. And that's hard to do. It's funny because we're so accustomed to grappling, trying to choke someone with our bare hands. But the idea of actually talking to that person is terrifying to a lot of folks. But you bring up a great point. The consequences of doing so are usually pretty minuscule. It's unlikely that a person is going to, be a jerk about it if you give them honest, good intention feedback. And moreover, if they are a jerk, well, who cares? Like, why would you want to train with a person like that anyway? Long-term, exposing that and moving on with your life, if you're not in a positive training environment, is still going to be the better option for you. So the consequences to speaking your mind in good faith are usually pretty slim. Most of the time, it leads to a positive outcome. So why don't you do it, right? And that's a skill that I wish people would translate more from the physical grappling to the mental grappling side of things, learning that a lot of the psychology of grappling is just as applicable when we're trying to negotiate or communicate with other people in the gym and even outside as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think there's so many people on our BJJ where the answer is just talk to them. Literally just go talk to your coach, or why are you telling us about this thing that's bothering you? Where what you should be talking, the person you should be talking to is your partner. And one of the things that can help here is also really mapping out the situation, just as you would do in sparring. So let's say you want to figure out how to better handle a certain position. What you would usually do, maybe if you're just trying to, defend an armbar, defend a triangle, you would figure out, okay, here are the risk modes, and here are the ways I would handle any of these potential risks. And by doing the same thing for the conversation, you first of all make yourself realize, okay, the risk modes here aren't really likely or really all that bad. But on top of that, here's how I'd be able to handle any of them. So if, let's say, the partner pushes back, here's what I could tell them. Or here's how I could move on if there is an issue. And that both helps you put it into practice, but also makes you more confident in your ability to do it. And it kind of nullifies that initial fight or flight instinct. So basically, you're trying to shift from flight mode into fight mode instead in a productive way.
So we've talked about this before on, at least in our mini episodes, the acute stress response, the fight, flight, sometimes freeze, sometimes fawn mode, right? The body's instincts to respond to stress, whether that stress be real or perceived. Can you maybe expand what that actually is and what's happening in the body when you go into that mode?
Yeah, so I'll simplify to talk about fight or flight, even though fawn and freeze are definitely relevant, and freeze in a sense is kind of tied into flight in this context. But basically, when our body senses a threat, and that could be a hungry lion chasing us on the savannas a very long time ago, or it could be talking to our coach or talking to our training partner, it basically goes into, okay, there is a problem here. How should I respond to it? And because we have to do it under high stress, the body kind of simplifies the situation and often thinks, okay, one option is to go in and fight. The other option is to run away from the problem. And both of these are perfectly valid solutions, depending on the situation. The problem in this particular context is that running away makes sense. Again, if it's a lion that you're running away from, or I don't know, anything else where running away is the appropriate response, but doesn't make sense for a lot of things where we do want to be engaging instead, like talking to someone, like facing something that makes us uncomfortable or anything along those lines. And basically the important thing there is to figure out how we can get our mind to shift from either, instead of flying away from this, I should be dealing with it, or instead of just having that strong stress response, getting your body to say, this is actually not a stressful situation, so I shouldn't be responding to it through a fight or flight mechanism in the first place.
Right. Now, I bet a lot of people, though, would say that's easier said than done, right? When you feel that acute stress response, being aware of it helps. But even so, it can be hard to just calm yourself down, especially in the moment. Maybe you could share some strategies around this. What have you found that works well for people who get incredibly stressed out at the idea of things like difficult conversations or upping their training regiment? What have you found that works that helps them give themselves perspective so that they can deal with that more productively?
Yeah, one thing I really like about this is there is a phenomenon called empathy gap, where we find it hard to empathize with mental states that are different from our own, or different from our current state. And one of the ways in which this manifests is that when we're in a cool emotional state, when we're calm and thinking rationally, it's hard for us to think about what a person is feeling when they're in a hot state, which could happen, for example, when you're stressed or afraid. And the problem with this is that then, it's very easy, like you've mentioned, it's very easy to tell someone, just calm down, bro, it's not that hard. When you're sitting there and you're calm and you're not actually facing the threat, as opposed to when they're there and whether they should be or not, their body reacts with stress. So this is a really important thing to keep in mind. In terms of how to deal with it in practice, one thing that can help is something called implementation intentions, or if-then rules. And the way they work is you find an obstacle that you think would be problematic, and you figure out, okay, if I encounter this issue, then I will respond a certain way. So for example, if I feel uncomfortable with my partner, I'm going to stop the roll and tell them, hey, this is too hard. You need to take it easy. And then if they keep doing it, I'm going to stop the roll again, shake their hand, and get out of there. And the nice thing about this is, again, it both helps you figure out how to deal with the situation in practice and also makes you more confident in your ability to do it. And ideally, you should be setting these rules that are as simple and automatic as possible. Because like we've said, it's easier said than done to implement these things. So when you have very in-depth, very complex rules, in reality, it's going to be difficult to actually implement them under stress. Whereas if you have something that is really heuristic-based, that is really simple, and your mind can just say, wait 1 second, this rule has been triggered, then it's going to be much easier to implement it. Another technique I wanted to mention that could help is self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is our belief in our ability to do the things we need to. And that could be, talking to our partner or starting to learn takedowns or whatever it is. And the thing that helps there is to basically figure out what we've successfully done before and really internalize that we've succeeded before and can therefore succeed again. So maybe if we're worried about talking to someone, we can say, you know what, actually, I've had this conversation, a similar conversation before with other people, and it went fine. So I can do it here too. Or maybe you can say, you know what, I feel awkward about talking in this particular situation because it's jiu-jitsu, but actually at work, I'm a much more confident person. So if I can have these assertive conversations there, I can also have them at the gym. And the goal there is, again, to basically build your confidence, your ability to do the things you need to, so you feel less stressed about doing them.
That's actually a great framing perspective. Again, something that I use with my kids sometimes when she'll talk about the interpersonal issues that she's having at school and how she's afraid to speak up. I always tell her, well, when you're at home, if something's bothering you, you don't have any issue telling mom and dad, right? You're always okay with telling us when something's on your mind. If we're doing something that is giving you grief, you talk to us about it. What's different about that? Like, why is it that you're okay at home talking to us about your problems openly, but when it's someone at school, it's harder to do? And so that's a great example about how reframing it and looking at it compared to different situations can help a lot. You also brought up the importance of talking to someone and slowing down a role, or telling your training partner if you feel like they're being unsafe. That's probably the most consequential place where procrastination affects us in jiu-jitsu. Looking at almost every time when I got injured in jiu-jitsu, there were warning signs. I saw it coming. I could tell the roll was getting unsafe, but rather than stopping it and saying something, I kept going, and then I got injured. And in retrospect, I could have saved myself a lot of time off the mats if I had just spoken up and just said, hey, we're going too hard, I want to slow down. That remains one of the hardest things for people to do in jiu-jitsu, though, because again, I think they have a lot of psychological baggage around that conversation about slowing down. What are your thoughts on that? Because I'm sure you've seen something similar as well.
Absolutely. I've been there as well. And I think often you can tell from the start, when you're starting the grips and some people are just either treating it as a death match or spazzing too hard. You can kind of feel it from the start. And I think usually you can tell that, okay, it's going to be that kind of roll. I think the most common problem I see there is that people know that it's the wrong thing, but instead of dropping out of it, they escalate too. And then it ends up becoming basically the first person started too hard. The other person responds by escalating. The first person feels vindicated and going hard, so they go harder, and it becomes very risky. And I think there, the nice thing is, again, about having, the problem is that once you've started rolling, your brain is now focusing on dealing with the roll for the most part. If you're much better than the other person, you can flow more and you can think about it, the meta conversation in the back of your mind. But for the most part, if you're having a hard roll, your body is hardwired to focusing on the situation where someone is trying to take you down and choke you out. And it's really tough to think about something, okay, this is too hard, maybe I should tell him to stop, how should I phrase it? And this is exactly where having an automatic if-then rule comes into effect. You should have that initial instinct in mind where if you feel unsafe, you know exactly what your response should be. So it's not that you're trying to think through the entire complex, awkward social situation as you're concurrently also rolling with the person, but rather you decide on what the rule is in advance when you're in a cool emotional state. And then when you're actually doing the roll, as soon as you get that, trigger where you say, this is not safe, I am in danger, I am very likely to get injured here, your mind immediately know to say, okay, can we take it down a notch? And then just build it like that. And then the first step is, can we take it down a notch? The second step is, hey, this is still too hard for me. And the third step is, thank you for the roll, no hard feelings, but this is done.
It's interesting too, because it's so hard for people to have that conversation. And I think we all know that if you feel a role is unsafe, you should say something, but very few people do. It's a difficult conversation to have, especially when you're already in the midst of a role. So you bring up a great example of taking the decision-making process out of the role and setting up an if-then in your mind beforehand. Can you elaborate on that concept and what you mean?
Yeah, so the main thing that this revolves around is basically looking at the reality of the situation. So if we were all perfect, we would be able to, under the stress of a role, say, hey, this is too much, let's take it down a notch. And I think we like to think of ourselves as people who can do this thing. In reality, however, it doesn't actually happen like that for the most part. In reality, we get stressed because we're under pressure, we're dealing with someone who's, by definition here, going too hard. So we're trying to protect ourselves physically from injury, and then try to think about the situation, of a complex interpersonal situation at the same time, just doesn't work. And the important thing here is not to plan for the perfect person who is able to handle any kind of situation like this, but rather say, okay, in reality, if this situation arises, I'm not going to be able to think about this off the top of my head, so I should be planning in advance to require as little thought as possible. And this is the exact same thing as with the self-control fallacy. Basically, we're planning not for what we wish we would do, but rather for what we think is likely to happen in reality.
That's a great example. Often when people plan around human behavior, they plan for the best case, the thing that we wish would happen rather than the thing that actually will happen. And good incentive structures work by accommodating for the fact that human beings are flawed. We do make mistakes. We don't always act our best. So how can our incentives reflect that and guide people in the direction we want them to guide into? The if-then example is a great one. I mean, for those who don't know the lingo, that comes from mostly the world of logic and programming, the very simple logic block and idea of if this happens, then I will do this thing as a response to that. And if you agree with yourself in advance that you will act in that manner, if this happens, then I will do this, you take the mental tax of having to think about complicated things out of the moment and you move them up in advance so that you've already done the decision. You've already made the mental decision to do something before it happens. And that means that in the moment, if you commit to that, then when it happens, you can just execute on that without thinking. That helps you take away the hesitation that can occur in the moment if you have to make difficult decisions while something else is already happening. This is a great remedy for hesitation problems in jiu-jitsu. If people feel like they're not reacting fast enough to their opponent, it might be because they haven't thought enough in advance about what they would do in that situation. So if you're ever in a sparring scenario and you feel like you're just too slow to respond to someone getting grips on you, just make a decision in advance about what you will do in that situation. And when it comes up in the roll, just do it. Don't overthink about what will happen if they respond a certain way. Just agree in advance that this is what you will do and then attempt it. And even if it doesn't succeed, at least the first time, it helps you overcome that hesitation and get the reps in that will make that technique work. So it's a great way to overcome hesitation. And I think that is probably also an appropriate solution for things that are maybe a little bit more nuanced than a jiu-jitsu role, like difficult conversations or situations that we might not want to find ourselves in, but probably will at some point.
Yeah, and what I really like about what you said is that in practice, this if-then approach is what we do when we train in jiu-jitsu. So initially, we teach ourselves, okay, if my partner does this, then I do this. Or if I want to do this, then I do that. But over time, the goal is to have these things embedded in us so automatically that we don't have to think about them consciously. So I don't know, if I'm going for a double leg, I know that as I do the snap down, if my partner doesn't resist, I'm going to finish the snap down. If they do posture up, then I shoot for the double leg. And initially, I'm going to have to think about that consciously. But over time, to get really good, the instinct should be there that I'm not processing actively, okay, he has gotten up, therefore I should now shoot for the takedown, but rather my body knows immediately to go for this because I know where he is and I'm responding automatically.
Yeah, the whole bit about responding automatically is so key when it comes to grappling. That is fundamentally our goal. And I think that can confuse people sometimes because we advertise jiu-jitsu as being an intellectual art, a thinking art. And it is true that there is an aspect of that that's involved in understanding the art and understanding how it works. But in the middle of a roll, that is not the time when you want to be thinking. You want to be as much on autopilot as possible. And the reason we train is to ingrain those good decisions into our muscle memory so that we can react and grapple on autopilot and make decisions faster. And that doesn't have to apply to just how you get grips or how you set up your hooks. That can also apply to the decisions you make about going to the gym, training, having difficult conversations, and the other things that can materialize in jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, and this ties into something called the hierarchy of competence or the levels of learning, where initially we have what's called unconscious incompetence. So as we're just starting, we don't know what we don't know. We don't understand what we're doing wrong. As we get better, we get to conscious incompetence. So we know that we're doing things wrong. We still can't avoid doing them wrong, but we're at least aware of it. From there, we graduate to conscious competence, where we're doing things right and we understand why we're doing them, but we still have to think about them actively. And ultimately, where we want to end up is where we can engage in unconscious competence. So we can do the right thing without having to think about that. And the goal is, even though it's a thinking art, it's a thinking art for figuring out what the right things are. But because it's also a combat sport that's being practiced under intense conditions, the goal is not to be thinking about these things actively, but get to the point where you've thought about them enough that you're responding automatically.
I have a theory that some of the coaching fails that we see in our sport happen because people have not trained and agreed with themselves to do the right thing in advance. And I mean, we've all seen this, right? It feels unfortunately way too common these days that you'll hear about coaching fails, like where someone in the gym does something that is in violation with the gym's code of conduct and the gym owner lets it slide. And inevitably what happens afterwards is that snowballs and it happens again and it makes things worse. And from the outside, we look at that and we think, well, how could that happen? I mean, we all know that this is wrong. How did a coach allow this to slide? And I think part of that is just avoidant behavior. Jiu-jitsu gym owners tend not to get into this expecting that one day they're going to have to broker some very difficult situation. And so when it happens, they're caught off guard. And instead of making an intelligent pre-planned decision, they can procrastinate, right? They can avoid having that difficult conversation even when it was the right thing to do. This is why I think it's so important for gyms to have and advertise a code of conduct about anything that is important in the gym, whether it be hygiene or athlete misconduct or training safety. Have that stuff front and center, have it on the wall, talk about with your students. Why? Well, not just because you want to make it clear to people, but also because it's a pre-commitment. If you put all of those rules in place, then you're setting up an if-then. And that makes it way easier in the moment to make that right decision. If someone shows up to the gym and they've got staff, it's real easy to make the decision because you wrote on the wall what you're going to do in that situation, right? You're going to remove that person until it's safe for them to train again. If there's an example of misconduct in the gym, then again, you've got a code of conduct about exactly what you will do. That takes the need for difficult decision-making out of the moment, and it makes it something that you can put in place in advance so that when it happens, the rules have already been written, and that makes it easier and more objective to follow through with the plan. Josh Waitzkin calls this building your triggers, setting up this process of making sure that whenever a certain thing happens, as close to on autopilot as possible, you just do the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. You can think about it as a trigger, as a cue, but the main thing is basically to be deliberate about this. And, it's fine to make mistakes initially. You can't always, I don't know, if you're just starting out, maybe you don't have a good rule in mind for what happens with someone if somebody shows up with giant ringworm on their hand because you never thought somebody would do something like that. Or what to do if somebody harasses someone there because you haven't planned for that. Ideally, we should plan for these things in advance, but the important thing is if we mess up because we haven't planned in advance, the main thing is to actually learn from this so that if it happens again, we know how to deal with it. Ideally, we should also react in such a way that prevents it. So going to the ringworm example or the staff example, having a discussion with people, setting the standards very clearly from the start, but also at the same time, basically knowing, okay, maybe this time I didn't respond the right way because it was the heat of the moment. I didn't know what to say, but next time I'm actually going to know because I'm going to be prepared for this. And the main thing here is basically to be deliberate and to learn from our mistakes so we can set ourselves up for success next time.
This is great. What are some other strategies and tactics that you found that help people with procrastination? Are there any other angles that we want to discuss here? Because I understand that you've got quite a few suggestions for this.
Yeah, I'm happy to go into a lot of them. So one that I talk about is, and I think this ties in a lot to both going back to training after a break or maybe stepping outside your comfort zone. So maybe you're a higher belt and you've never done takedowns and you know that it's time to start doing it, but you don't want to get back to feeling like a beginner. Or maybe you've only done gi and you don't want to go back, start doing no-gi because you don't want to feel like a beginner again or something like that. And one of the things that I talk about is unpacking these large, intimidating tasks like learning how to go in the gi or learning how to do no-gi or learning how to do takedowns and figuring out, okay, instead of treating this as a whole giant project, I'm just going to focus on the next few small micro steps and just try to achieve those. So instead of saying I'm going to learn takedowns, what I'm going to say is I'm going to do, 10 minutes of takedown drilling in my drilling session. Or I'm going to learn how to do grip fighting. Or I'm going to learn a single takedown. Or whatever it is, and just focusing on that one thing. And that makes it much more concrete. That makes it much more clear what you're dealing with. And that makes it much less intimidating because instead of trying to deal with a whole giant thing, you're dealing just with a single specific concrete step that is the most useful for you to focus on right now.
Yeah, the art of decomposing your problems into smaller problems is so key. If you fail to do so, your problems will feel insurmountable because they kind of are. You've made them bigger than they need to be. And you can't action on a giant, vaguely formed problem. But if you start breaking that down into actionable day-by-day chunks, it gets a lot easier to rack up quick wins, get momentum. And then once you start chewing off pieces of that big problem, it starts to make the scope of what's left much clearer and easier to do.
Yeah. And another thing that can help with this is to reject perfectionism for good enough. I think it's rare that we set up intentionally saying, I want to be perfect at doing this. But at the same time, we tend to have this kind of implicit model where we don't want to mess up. And in our mind, we're thinking, if I make any mistakes, I learn this, and that means I suck at jiu-jitsu. That means even worse, I'm stupid or anything along those lines. And it's really important to be deliberate and tell ourselves, I am here to learn. I am going to suck at this as I start doing it initially. That's perfectly fine because the goal isn't to be perfect. The goal is to learn. The goal is to improve. So what I should be aiming for is not doing this the perfect way, but doing this better than I've done this before. It's about learning how I can do it better next time.
Yeah, that's a great example. And perfectionism is such a common problem in jiu-jitsu. We've talked about that quite a bit on here. And I know that serious athletes tend to really struggle with this because they hold themselves to a very high standard. And while that can be a good thing, it can also lead to feelings of perfectionism that can get in the way of you taking action. Because if you feel like things need to be perfect, then you might reject anything less than that. And you can get into the situation where you wind up not taking any action because you can't create the perfect environment to make that action happen. That's a great example that you brought up as well. Maybe expand on this a little more, because I know that perfectionism is such a common problem for jiu-jitsu athletes, especially people who really want to be successful on the competition scene.
Yeah, and to be fair, perfectionism has both adaptive and maladaptive sides. So it can help us, but it can also hurt us. And it can help us by being a driving force that pushes us to want to do better and to want to be really, really great and be amazing, especially if you're at the higher levels. The problem is that it can also push you to be too hard on yourself. It can push you to not do something because the gulf between where you currently are and where you want to be is just too insurmountable in your mind. It can push us to feel terrible even when we do make good progress because it doesn't meet our unattainable standards. And, it never will because they're unattainable. So it's not that perfectionism is inherently bad, but it can often go awry and basically hurt us, whether it's because it's paralyzing us or even if it's not necessarily paralyzing us, it can still have implications for our well-being, both physical and mental and emotional, that hurts in the long term and cause burnout. So what I would say is it's fine to aspire for very, very high standards, but there is a way in which you go about it. And there's a difference between saying, I want to be great at this technique versus I shouldn't be making any mistakes. Or if this technique isn't perfect, then I suck at jiu-jitsu. And it's important to notice these differences. And one area where it's particularly important is the difference between perfectionism that's driven by your expectations of yourself versus perfectionism that's driven by either other people's expectations or what you think are other people's expectations. So sometimes people feel, if I do this technique poorly, then I'm disappointing my coach. And out of some outside some very limited cases, that should not be the case. So we build up these expectations of perfectionism, what we think are other people's expectations of perfectionism of us, whereas in reality, people are happy for us to make progress. People are happy for us to give it a good try. That's another common pitfall to watch out for.
Yeah, this makes me think of people who are returning from a layoff due to something like injury. Sometimes they procrastinate to come back because they're scared that they're not going to be as good as they were before and they're not going to perform well. And my answer to that is, well, of course you're not going to perform well. You had an injury, you had a layoff. Part of the process is when you get back, you rebuild, and you shouldn't expect yourself to be perfect and to come right back on the mats just as good, if not better than when you left. This is part of the process. No one is going to judge you for that. They're going to expect that. And frankly, they're just going to be happy that you're back. So again, you brought up a great example of how sometimes it is our own expectations and our own perceptions of the people around us that lead us to procrastinate. But the reality is these are just our projections and they may not actually map to what the people around us feel at all. Most of the time, if you're in a healthy training room, the people in there with you are just happy to see you there and to have you there and to have you working to get better. They're not as judgy about you as you might be about yourself.
Exactly. And that's why you want to be deliberate about what your goals are. So when you're coming back, if you come back without being deliberate about this, I think we often default to, okay, my goal is to be amazing at jiu-jitsu again. And if I come back and I'm not as good as I used to be, then that's terrible. And that's not a fun thing. And that can either cause you to just not come back at all, or if you come back, it cause you to push too hard and get injured. And because of this, what would be useful is to instead say, okay, my goal is to get back to jiu-jitsu. Obviously, if I have not trained for a long while, I'm going to be worse now. And that's okay because the whole point of training is to get better. So my goal now for coming back is maybe to just get back in the swing of things without getting injured. Or my goal is to just come to the mats today. I'm not even going to try sparring. I'm only going to drill. Or I'm only there to talk to my coach and see what he's looking for me to do, what he thinks would be the best course of action for me here. But basically being really deliberate about avoiding this mindset that is bad for us, which could be, I want to be amazing again and I have to be amazing right now or I'm a failure. And instead figuring out, okay, my goal for now is to just have a good enough session where I'm getting back in shape, I'm reminding myself of the moves, and I'm not getting injured.
This is absolutely something I fail to understand, especially when I was younger. We sometimes feel like progress is always moving in an upward direction, but that is not the case. In any sort of journey, there will be times when you stall out or even backslide. Injuries are a great example of that. The most important thing is not to be making measurable upward progress every single day, although that's the goal. But the most important thing is to be consistent, because that is how we achieve upward progress over time. There will be days when you're just not performing to your own standards. There will be times when life gets in the way and you backslide. And rather than looking at that as some sort of terrible problem, we should just come to terms with the fact that that is part of life. That happens. Things happen. You got injured. Maybe other priorities came up. Maybe you just got older. Maybe you're just not, getting as better every day as you were accustomed to in the past. That's fine. The answer is consistency, and is to come back and to just keep trying and keep going, because over time, that consistency will smooth out the line of progress. And that's how we start to see results. It's not that every day we get better. We do often backslide, or maybe we change the way that we measure progress. As I get older, the things that I see as success are quite different from the things that I would have considered success 20 years ago. So that's just a matter of perspective, right? We have different goals as they evolve as well. And I think that we've got to be very careful to make sure that our desire to always be getting better doesn't become so overwhelming that it actually leads to us procrastinating or giving up, right? I see that happen sometimes where people feel like, well, I'm just not getting better. I've lost the motivation now because I'm not seeing progress. Maybe I even feel like I'm getting worse, so I quit or I procrastinate. And this is just going to prevent you from hitting your goals. The better thing to do is to continue down that road and accept the fact that, look, you're not always going to be moving upward in a straight line. Sometimes it's not that simple.
Yeah, and I think one of the saddest failure modes that I see is people being too hard on themselves, training harder and harder and harder, and getting burned out and just sleeping. And I've seen this happen so many times, and it's such a pity because it tends to be the people who love jiu-jitsu, and then they don't know how to channel that love in a healthy way. And they end up being too hard on themselves, and it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because they're training harder, and it actually makes it harder for them to concentrate. It makes it harder for them to think clearly. And then they feel, okay, I'm training harder, but I'm actually not improving faster. And then they get even more discouraged, and that makes it harder to train. And eventually they're training 6 or 7 times a week. They don't feel they're making progress. Their body gets worn out, and they just end up leaving. And the solution here is to be compassionate toward yourself. Not because, we're going easy on ourselves just for the sake of going easy, but rather because that is what is actually the best for you and for your jiu-jitsu in the long term.
We should expand on this because burnout is such a huge problem in jiu-jitsu. I mean, so many people stop training because they burn out. Can you maybe expand a bit on this? What is burnout? How would you define this? And I know that's not an easy thing to do because it can manifest in a lot of different forms, but how do you explain burnout, and how does it parallel to things like procrastination?
So I talk about burnout a lot in the book, and one of the things I present there is a framework called the procrastinator archetype. So 9 different common reasons for procrastination, and one of them is the burnout. And basically, we get burnt out when we work too hard or work in a way that is very draining. So work too hard could be training 6, 7 days a week without taking enough breaks, or however long it takes for your body to get worn out. And working in a way that is draining can be things like maybe you're training in a very stressful environment. Maybe you're training, but you don't actually feel like you're improving because of perfectionism or anything else that makes the work feel worse for you, makes training feel worse for you. That is very common for people who train. And unfortunately, it's especially common for the people who love jiu-jitsu the most.
Yeah, it is a bit of a trap because the more that you love jiu-jitsu, the more you invest in it. And it sometimes feels like those are the people who burn out because they put so much into it that they wear themselves out. And sometimes they feel that this is necessary or essential. I mean, when I was younger, I used to train every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. I'm not going to do that now. I mean, my training is way less than it used to be, but I still see myself as being a part of the jiu-jitsu community and understanding that I have to balance all of the things in my life, and I can't let jiu-jitsu take over everything that I do. That's not where I'm going to find my maximum enjoyment. And so although it has a place in my life, it's not the focal point of my life.
Yeah, absolutely. And even for people who it is a focal point for, even for people who are competitors and this is the main thing in their life, there still needs to be balance. Because otherwise you do end up getting burned out and you end up either leaving jiu-jitsu or having such a toxic relationship with it that it's not healthy for you, it's not constructive for your ability to improve, and over time you will end up leaving it regardless. And there's also a vicious cycle there where maybe people really love jiu-jitsu, so they start training more, and suddenly they notice that they're not improving as fast as they used to, even though they're training more. So they push themselves harder, they get more frustrated, the rate of learning becomes even worse, and they get more and more burnt out over time. And then where this ties into procrastination is where they start saying, you know what, I'm going to stop training, or maybe I'm going to go to training less, or maybe they postpone other kind of things that they could be training with. But overall, it's terrible both for how they feel about jiu-jitsu and for their ability to practice it in the short term and the long term.
Well, Itamar, thanks so much for doing this. This is a fantastic chat. And as people probably gathered from the conversation, there's a lot more that we could get into here. I would love to have a conversation with you just about the 9 archetypes of procrastination. But maybe this is as good a time as any to tell people where they can find more information if they want it. Why don't you talk a bit about the book and what people can expect in it and where they can find it?
Yeah, so the book is called Solving Procrastination, the science of why we put things off and how to finally stop. You can find it basically, so it's published by Penguin Random House. So you can find it in every major retailer, Amazon, Barnes & Noble's, Bookshop, Waterstones if you're in the UK, anywhere you might want to buy the book. And it's basically the culmination of years of hard work into figuring out, okay, how can we help people overcome their procrastination? I've put everything that I think you should know there, from why we procrastinate in the first place, to what are the best strategies to use in general, to how to figure out which particular strategies you should use. And ultimately, if you feel that you procrastinate, whether that's in jiu-jitsu, whether that's in other areas of your life, or whether you're trying to help someone else in your life stop procrastinating, I really, really recommend you check out the book.
Fantastic. And probably a great resource, not just for individuals who deal with this problem, but also for coaches as well, because we need to be mindful of how common procrastination is as a mental hang-up for the people in the room. And so being equipped to help coach people through that is going to be just as helpful, if not more helpful, than the actual jiu-jitsu technique that we teach. So I will link to all of that in the show notes. If people want to find your book, I will make it easy to find. Just pop open your podcast player, go to notes or whatever, and I'll give you a one-tap link that'll take you to the book. And I'll also put a link to our stuff. Everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. We've got tons of episodes of this podcast, plus mini episodes that go into concepts much more quickly. Many of the concepts that we talked about here today, we have dedicated mini episodes on if you want to just better understand what those are. So again, all of that is completely free, no ads, all in our podcast feed. I would also suggest, if you're not already signed up to the BJJ Mental Models newsletter, you want to do that. There's a lot of great thought pieces that we publish every week on Friday. And again, also completely free, over 15,000 strong. And beyond all of that, if you would like to level up with us, please do consider joining BJJ Mental Models Premium. You'll get access to the world's largest audio library of jiu-jitsu masterclasses. If you like this kind of conversation about strategy, tactics, and psychology, the thinking around jiu-jitsu, this is the kind of stuff that we specialize in, and we have long-form conversations there that go much deeper than what we talk about here on the podcast. We've also got some great courses coming up. We're just in the process of launching an awesome new game planning course with Josh Wentworth. If you loved our previous course with him and the episodes that he's done on the main feed with us, this new course is probably something you're going to like. And we've got another course coming up with Beatrice Jin, this time about competition planning and preparation, which I think people will like as well. We strive to really create something unique and get everyone their money's worth on this. I think you'll love it. So please do check that out. All of that is at bjjmentalmodels.com. But Itamar, thanks so much for doing this, man. Fantastic chat about a really important topic. I appreciate you presenting the work here.
Thank you, Steve. My pleasure. I appreciate you having me on.
Most welcome, sir. Thank you to the listeners as well. We appreciate you too, and we will talk to you next time. See you then.